Hi and welcome back to a new episode in the Habit Tracker series. In the last video, we created 3 simple view components to help us show the different parts of the Habit Tracker UI. Today we will continue to build on this by moving all the habit information into a single Pinia store that can be shared by all view components. But before we begin, I want to fix a small problem. For some reason this didn't happen in the last video, but if you load the UI and it looks like this, simply open tailwind.config.js and add this line. Before we start writing tests, first we need to do some setup. Because we are going to use Axios as our way of fetching the list of habits from the server, we need a way to mock the Axios calls and return sample data. To achieve this, we will use a package called mock_service_worker. This will provide a fake network layer for our tests, intercepting requests and replying with fake responses. Let's start by installing the package. Sail npm e-t msw. Now we need to create a setup file that will be executed before any test. Open v.config.js and add this line in the test section. Now create the setup file. Start by importing before all, after all, and after each from vtest. Import setup server from msw/node and import rest from MSW. Let's define the format of our mocked responses. Since I'm going to use Laravel API resources later on, I might as well stick to the default response structure, where the list of records is wrapped inside a data array. Next, let's define the handlers. These are the ones that will intercept requests like get or post and return fake responses. We only need one, so let's define it like this. We create a REST handlers array with just one entry, which is REST get HTTP localhost 3000 API habits. The second parameter is the handler function, which takes in a request, a response, and the context. And here we simply return response, context status 200, and context JSON habits. Notice that I use the port 3000 since that is what the test will use. And the URL is where I will implement the backend call later on. Now create a new server using setup server, pass the handlers, and start the server before all the tests. We also need to close the server after all the tests are complete. And we are going to reset the handlers after each single test. Okay, now we can start writing our tests. Since we are creating a new store, let's begin with the test case for it. Create a new file inside tests unit called habitsstore.test.js. Import create Pinia and set active Pinia from Pinia. Before each, describe it expect from vtest and import use habits store from stores habits. And then set up the describe block. We need to create an active Pinia instance for each test. And also make use of the new store. Let's start with fetching the list of habits. So let's say it fetches the list of habits. This will be an async function. First we await for habits.fetch, and then we expect the habit list length to be 1. The idea is that we will ask the server for a list of habits, and then store that in a state variable called list. Let's create a new folder inside resources.js called stores. And inside, create a new file called habits.js. Restart the tests. Start by importing Axios from Axios, define store from Pinia, and ref from view. Now define the new store. Create the state variable called list, and this will be an empty array. And then define the fetch action. This will be an async function, and within a try-catch block, let's say response equals await Axios get API habits. And then inside list value, we store response.data.data. And in case of an error, we simply log it to the console. Expose both the state and the fetch action down here. Okay, the next thing we need is a way to increment the executions count for a specific habit in the list. So let's say it increments the execution count. This will also be asynchronous. First, we await for habits.fetch, define the habit index as 0, and then habits.list, add the habit index, .execution count equals 0. Then we call habits new execution and pass the habit index, and we expect the habit list at the habit index execution count to be 1. Let's create this new action in the store. It's very simple. This will be called new execution and will receive a habit index, and we simply do list value at habit index execution count ++. And don't forget to expose that action here. Finally, for display purposes, I need an action that will return the % for a specific habit in the list. Since we always need to fetch the list of habits, let's move this to the before each block. And now for the test, it returns a %, and then we say habit list at habit index times per day equals 3, and then habits.list at habit index execution count equal 1. And we expect the result of calling habits.% with habit index to be 33. Now let's define the new action in the store. This will be called % and will take a habit index. And for the return value, first we check that the times per day variable is greater than 0. And if so, we return math.floor and we divide list value habit index execution count by list value habit index times per day and multiply that by 100. Otherwise, we return 0. And we expose the action here as well. Okay, that's all we need for this store. Given that we are now dealing with a list of habits instead of a single one, like we've been doing so far, why don't we rework the index template to show a list of habits as well? Let's create a new component that will take care of this. There is no need to test it since the store tests already cover it. Create a new file inside resources.js components called habits.view. And for the template, let's take this part from the index template and paste it here. Let's import habit.info from components habit.info.view, execute button from components execute.button.view, progress bar from components progress.bar.view, and finally import useHabitStore from stores habits. Let's use the store and create a new method called fetchHabits. All we need to do here is call the habits.fetch method. And after that, we just call fetchHabits. To iterate over the list of habits, let's add a v4 in here. And all we need to do now is replace these props with the values from habit. In the next few steps, I'm going to skip the backend test so that we can quickly take this new component for a spin. We will rework the backend tests in the next video. Before we try this out, we need a new model and a migration for the executions. So let's get that out of the way right now. All we need for this table is the habit ID for the relation. Now we can add the relation to the habit model. We need a new route and a controller, so let's quickly create a controller called Habits API Controller. I will use the API routes for this example, so open routes api.php and add a new route. As I mentioned before, I'll use an API resource to return the list of habits. So let's create one right now. We can now define the index method in the controller and return the new resource as a collection. Using the withCount method, we add an executions count property to each model in the result. Okay, at this point we should be able to visit localhost API habits and get a list of results. Oh, right, we don't have any. So let's create a few real quick. First, run the migration, and then let's open a Tinker terminal. Let's use app models habit and then create a new habit. Set the name to drink water times per day 3 and then save it. Let's create another one. Set the name to meditate times per day 2 and then save. And let's create one more. Set the name to read for 30 minutes times per day 1 and save. Okay, let's try this again. Perfect. Now let's try adding a couple of executions. Let's say habits find 1 and then executions create. Let's add one more, habit find 2, executions create. And as you can see, we now have values in executions count. Okay, let's open resources.js, app.js, and import the habits component. Remove the other components since they now live inside the habits component. And also import create Pinia since we are now using Pinia stores. Create a new Pinia instance. Replace these components with just the habits component. And then use the Pinia instance. Open the index template and replace this with just the habits component. Now we can visit the habits page and we get a list of habits from the server. Obviously, these components are still not using the newly created store. So, in the next video, we will rework our test cases to make use of our Pinia store, as well as reworking the backend tests to fit our new user interface. See you in the next one.